This is an oyster.
Oyster reef restoration in bays in Texas has generally been very successful, and one reason for that is that we're one of the last places in the country that really do have healthy populations of oysters to produce those larvae. What we're missing is that hard structure for those oysters to attach to.
Well, I think the major issue you were facing with oysters and oyster reefs is that there's just not enough of them.
Having oyster mariculture along the Texas coast, having more oysters in the water, having more oyster resources available for consumers, it's a win-win.
Our intent is to put the oyster back where it was so that it is of benefit to the bays. It improves the quality of the bays. It improves the ecosystem services of the bay. It also serves as habitat for sports fish, so it improves sports fishing along the entire Texas coast.
Can you tell I love oysters?
People along the Texas Gulf Coast have had an appetite for oysters that predates written history. 3,000 years ago, bands of Caracua Indians were feasting on oysters and clams as they roamed up and down the coastal plains from Corpus Christi Bay north to Galveston Bay. The leftover shells also provided them with material for tools and shell ornaments. Oysters were equally important to the early European settlers and all the small communities along the coast. They provided an abundant food source that was both cheap and easy to harvest for market. By the 1880s, Texas was the only state that was shipping oysters to other regions to satisfy the growing demand for them. And up until the early part of the 20th century, the supply of Texas oysters seemed to be almost inexhaustible.
If you look back in people have gone back and did surveys back in the 30s and 40s of the status of natural resources along the coast, they talked about oyster reefs that were a mile or miles long and hundreds of feet wide. I mean, there were these types of oyster reefs in every Texas bay.
But the abundance would not last. Now, as late as 1910, Texas oysters were still mainly harvested by hand or from boats with long wooden tongs. But even so, the oyster beds were already showing signs of being overfished. Catches declined even further as communities dammed rivers to provide fresh water supplies, raising salinity in the bays to levels that oysters simply could not tolerate. And within a few more decades, shell dredging became a deadly threat to Texas oysters.
Oysters that were in great supply here, and to the extent that dredging began to use that shell for not only cooking it and making shellcrete for bricks for construction, but also for paving streets and house foundations and so forth. In fact, in Sinton, our driveway was oyster shell.
And in one instance, shells were even used as ground cover in a cemetery.
My grandfather, the fine shell that washed up and piled along the beach, he liked to use that on our cemetery plot. He would have myself and another man that worked for us. Periodically, we would take a truck up to what's called Tin Can Point here, and we would shovel it in the truck and take it to the cemetery and put it on our plot rather than have grass. It was covered with this real fine shell.
It was also a readily available road-building material, and that would seal the doom of oyster reefs in many Texas bays. The huge oyster beds were mined to the very last shell, and old photographs like these show the mountains of shell that were taken from the bays.
There were oyster shell roads all up and down the Texas coast that connected all the major coastal cities for years. And when we talk about mining oysters, they weren't mining fossil oysters. They were mining live oysters. They didn't care about the meat. They just wanted that shell to make roads.
And the once pristine bays that had been teeming with marine life were now in a downward spiral.
Population started declining to where, in one report, Parks and Wildlife stated, I think it was 1947, as locally the oyster populations are decimated and will probably never return. And that was a very early warning signal to what is seen as the situation today.
As a result of the wholesale dredging, along with the impacts of droughts, disease, and siltation from hurricanes, More than 70% of the reefs along the Texas coast are now gone. Lawsuit settlements related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill included $160 million for oyster restoration, with some of that money earmarked for Texas. And today, the future of the state's oyster fishery looks promising. In 2019, the Texas legislature approved a bill making oyster aquaculture legal here in Texas. And thanks to a very generous grant from the Ed Rochelle Foundation, a new nonprofit organization was created to focus on conservation mariculture. It's called PMAR, an acronym for Palacios Marine Agricultural Research Incorporated.
PMAR was established for a variety of reasons, but probably the main one is for conservation of the Texas coast. It's not the way it used to be when the fishing was plentiful. You could go out and get all the oysters you wanted and blue crabs, and as a result of that, we wanted to establish a mechanism or an organization whereby we could start to make a difference along the Texas coast in a very big way.
With the legalization of oyster aquaculture, Texans now have a new option to raise oysters in the bays and sustainably harvest them for consumption. And as more people rely on oyster aquaculture to grow and harvest this commercially important food product, that will help ease the fishing pressure on wild oyster reefs and allow them to grow and rebuild. Additionally, aquaculture products like spat on shell and eyed larvae can be used to build new reefs in the bays and restore the oyster reef habitat that we have lost. PMAR's ultimate goal is to restore and conserve the wild oyster reefs along the Texas coast, while also supporting the new oyster aquaculture industry through industry-related research. However, we still don't know everything there is to know about the mechanisms, the biology, and the science of oysters to help make that big difference.
We want to establish also a research laboratory that's basic research that will help us answer and address some of those questions that are associated with the follow-through of building reefs, of producing more oysters for both reef building and consumption through aquaculture, and the whole issue, the whole thing of aquaculture ranching or aquaculture farming of oysters.
Dr. Victoria Puente will head up the research lab that will be located in Corpus Christi.
And so things that we are looking at researching are things like doing a breeding program, so the genetics that go along with the breeding program. We're also looking at public health issues related to Vibrio bacteria, fecal coliforms in the water, all of that stuff. And we can also look at how to improve reef restoration efforts.
The fundamental research done in the lab will then go to an oyster hatchery now under construction at a site in Palacios, Texas. It was selected because of the seafood industries already located there.
We have a big shrimp producer here. We have redfish farms here. A lot of the locals are crabbers, so it kind of fits. It's a good niche here.
The hatchery here in Palacios is going to be primarily a production facility. We'll be producing oysters both for reef restoration projects and for commercial oyster farms all across the coast of Texas.
Again, the primary focus of PMAR is the conservation of the Texas coast, and oyster reefs provide an essential foundation for healthy ecosystems in our bays and estuaries. A single adult oyster can filter and clean as much as 50 gallons of water every day, and large reefs can clean entire bays.
You know, most people recognize and appreciate oysters because they're so delicious to eat, myself included. But a lot of people don't understand all the other benefits that oysters bring. So besides supporting a very, economically viable commercial fishery, they also create these three-dimensional reefs that help increase biodiversity in the bays. They're filter feeders, so they clear and clean up our bay waters. Their reefs can serve as a protective living breakwater of shorelines in the bays, and then also we're just starting to learn a lot about how they can actually draw down and capture carbon, CO2, from the atmosphere. So lots of benefits from oysters.
The dual nature of PMAR's efforts will provide opportunities for competing interests like regulators and conservationists and oystermen and oyster lovers to all get what they want, which is more oysters.
Well, certainly. I mean, when you can build the structure that attracts the fish And it's something it's important for us as an organization, but it's important for everybody that utilizes that resource. And so we're really proud to be partners with groups that are involved in oyster research and oyster habitat restoration, because not only does it help the ecosystem, but it brings more people to the coast. It lets them participate in those outdoor activities that we all love.
Just as a grain of sand in an oyster can eventually become a pearl, as PMAR grows and evolves, it's destined to become one of the jewels of the Texas Gulf Coast.
Over the next 20, 30 years, we want to be able to have produced and delivered enough oysters, built enough reef for the Texas coast to put the oyster back in the status it was, even before that 20 and 30 years ago time frame that most people can associate with. All of the small communities along the Texas coast, at least from Corpus north, were built on oysters. We want to get back to that situation where we don't have to have these issues associated with commercial fishing, aquaculture, and whether we're taking too many oysters out of the bay. That'll be good for sport fishing. That'll be good for jobs. That'll be good for, all of the industries that depend upon the Texas coast.